Hey guys, this video will talk about how budgetary policy can help achieve strong economic growth. Now, we know that the goal is strong and sustainable economic growth, but since we're talking about budgetary policy as an aggregate demand management policy, we're going to separate this goal into two, strong being one part and sustainable being the second part. But since sustainable has to do with aggregate supply of the economy, we're not going to talk about budgetary policy as an aggregate supply management policy as of yet, but we're just going to focus on the aggregate demand management, and that relates back to this idea of strong economic growth. Okay, so we know that strong economic growth means that we have an increase in GDP of around 3 to 4%, right? We know that that constitutes strong economic growth because we are not actually intruding on the achievement of low inflation, and we're moving towards this idea of full employment. So that's strong economic growth. So we're going to see how budgetary policy can actually affect this. What we need to know that is that if we start off with, say, low economic growth, this necessarily means that aggregate demand is slowing. So we know that aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? And we know that when there is low economic growth, aggregate demand must necessarily be low because of the circular flow. And so what the government does is that it adopts expansionary budgetary policy. So we must note that before we go into the analysis, we must note that the government actually has two options. It can either let the economy play its course and let the business cycle run its course, so this being the business cycle, the actual natural flow of the economy would actually result in an increase in economic growth following a recession. But sometimes because this steady increase from the recession to back to the peak is very slow, the government has to make a judgment as to whether they should speed up this process. But as we'll see, by speeding up this process, by using expansionary budgetary policy in order to stimulate economic growth, it may have some consequences on inflation. So we know that assuming that there is low economic growth, and as a result there must be low inflation. But at the moment, because inflation is low, the government doesn't have to worry about achieving this because it is already under control. So it turns its attention into the achievement of strong economic growth. So we're going to use this aggregate demand model, and we're going to see that by using expansionary budgetary policy, we can see that government expenditure would increase either by G1 or G2, and again consumption expenditure would increase due to an increase in transfer payments as well as a decrease in tax. So we know that by adopting an expansionary stance, automatic stabilizers would necessarily mean that transfer payments would increase due to this low economic growth, resulting in low employment rates, and hence more people would then again be eligible to file for transfer payments, to receive transfer payments here. And again, because there is low economic growth, and because in economic downswings income necessarily is very low, that means automatic stabilizers in taxation result in a decrease in taxation, and therefore an increase in disposable income to stimulate aggregate demand in that way. And again, discretionary policies here, discretionary policies of government spending could actually again stimulate aggregate demand so as to move towards achieving this goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So that's how the government can use budgetary policy to achieve strong economic growth in times of downturn. But we're going to look at the consequences of this to inflation. And this is a very a judgment that the government needs to make regarding their policy choices. This is a very important judgment that they need to make. So we're going to look at this in terms of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework. We have pi being the inflation rate, and y here being GDP. So instead of saying price and quantity as we did in the microeconomic side of this course, we're looking at the price or the general price level being the inflation rate, and y being the product or the quantity produced or the GDP. Okay, so we know that in the short term inflation is steady, and this is the short run aggregate supply. And again, we have a long run aggregate supply which is constant, and we have y star. So this is a long run aggregate supply. And we have aggregate demand again being a downward sloping in nature, due to various factors that we've gone through in our lecture on why aggregate demand is downward sloping. And so we can see now the equilibrium output here is at y star, and the inflation rate, let's say here, is around 3%. But let's assume that the economic growth or the GDP rate is actually 2%. And this is actually below what the government actually wants, between 3 to 4%. So what happens here is that the economy is actually at an equilibrium, where the long run aggregate supply is the same as the short run aggregate supply. So we haven't achieved strong economic growth. We are actually below this target range of 3 to 4%. So the government has made a discretionary choice as to stimulate aggregate demand. So we can see in the short term, when aggregate demand increases, when both C and G increase, the aggregate demand in the short term would actually shift to the right from AD to AD1, and as a result, the output or the GDP level has increased from Y star to Y1, and perhaps this Y1 level is around 4%. So in the short term, of course, you have seen that the output has increased to this band between 3 to 4%, and hence the economic growth or the goal of strong economic growth has been achieved. But now we can see that this has in fact caused an expansionary gap. And what this means is that producers are producing in excess of what they can produce in the long term. So here, full employment would be achieved, but people or businesses will start to employ those structurally unemployed, and those cyclically unemployed will be then overworked, and so that we have reached a point where we are producing above the natural output. And so what happens is that the aggregates or the short run aggregate supply curve would increase as businesses realize that they're producing at above capacity, and hence will increase their prices. So the general price level would then increase to pi 1 here, which equals the short run aggregate supply 1. And as we can see, now there is a new equilibrium formed given this increase in aggregate demand at pi 1. And perhaps this inflation rate is around 5%. And so this is the problem the government has to weigh up. If in the short term output is very low and that economic growth is not strong, they could aim or seek to increase aggregate demand unnaturally by stimulating it using budgetary policy. But the consequence of that is, although in the short run economic growth will increase, and inflation will stay the same, and all the other goals will be achieved. In the long run, this would actually build in a permanently higher rate of inflation. So that's how budgetary policy can affect strong economic growth. You can affect it by stimulating aggregate demand, and using the circular flow model, we can see that when demand increases, therefore production will increase. However, although this may be the case, that strong economic growth may be achieved, this may come at a cost of a permanently higher rate of inflation at pi 1 right here.